Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lisa Donner. I'm the Executive Director of the Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund and Americans for Financial Reform. We are dedicated to changing the rules for finance in order to build a more just economy and society. And we're a coalition that includes hundreds of groups, including consumer advocates, civil rights organizations, labor, and community-based membership organizations, and more. And it is a great pleasure and an honor today to have the chance to have this conversation with Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Director Rohit Chopra. For those who are new to this space and conversation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB, has the job of protecting families and law-abiding businesses from unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices by financial institutions, and ensuring that markets for consumer financial products and services are fair, transparent, and competitive. And as the director of the CFPB, Chopra is also a member of the board of directors of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And we'll stop with initials there. Before Director Chopra was a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, where, among other things, he worked to strengthen that agency's enforcement work and stop abuses of small businesses. And before that, he was at the CFPB as a student loan ombudsman, where he and the Bureau played really just a crucial role in shining a spotlight on predatory practices in the student loan market and by abusive for-profit schools, and on the crisis of student debt more generally. And in all of those posts, he has been just deeply committed to serving justice and the public interest, and to standing up to powerful corporations when it's necessary in order to do that, and deeply, deeply thoughtful about how to get that job done. So I'm very glad to get to talk with him today, and only wish we had an actual fire in the fireplace to talk in front of. Just one housekeeping item, which is that after Director Chopra and I speak, we'll have some time for audience questions, and you can start sending those at any time during the conversation by sending them to the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen. So before I start asking questions, Director Chopra, is there anything you wanna say?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me today. I think it's not a secret that all of the organizations affiliated with the AFR Coalition played such a pivotal role in cleaning up some of the worst abuses of the financial system, in fighting to create the CFPB and so many other important financial reforms. I think many of your organizations, and many of you are probably here today, remember when a lot of the agencies just weren't even listening as massive abuses in the mortgage market and student loan markets were occurring. And now we actually have the tools to stop it, and we need to use them effectively before harm really spreads. So all of the work that we do at the CFPB would not be possible without all of you.
Thank you. And it's an excellent transition to the first thing I want to ask you, which is to talk just about some of the consumer finance problems that you think people are sort of facing in the most dramatic way, and that are priorities for you to deal with. And I'll start by asking about some things that are clearly on the agency's agenda, and then maybe there are things you want to add to that list. So first, a request for information on junk fees was one of the very early things the Bureau did when you became director. Can you talk about what you learned from that process and what comes next there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that so many people really have thought through after COVID, obviously our physical health were high on our mind, but our financial health and our financial condition became more in focus, especially as the economy was recovering. And so while the country was dealing with inflation, the globe dealing with inflation, it drew even more attention to what are all of these junk fees that we pay on a day-to-day basis that have just crept through the entire economy. And I can't tell you how often we hear about fees that are assessed on people for services that aren't even services at all. They didn't ask for it, they didn't want it. and it just feels like it's wearing people down. So we have been using what we've learned there to identify where are there illegal fees, where are there fees that may be unfair, or where are there fees that business models are built on that aren't indicative of a competitive marketplace. Overdraft fees being a big one. We're really studying that and taking enforcement actions, and we're seeing how the market is shifting and competing again, with some financial institutions eliminating them altogether. Credit card late fees. We've talked and released data about the billions of dollars that credit card issuers are assessing on people using a immunity provision created by the Fed many years ago. Pay to pay fees. The list goes on and on. So we really think that there's more work to do to ensure that when you're charged for something, it's priced at a competitive cost and you're actually getting something for it.
Super helpful. Thank you. Another place that we can tell that the Bureau is putting really a heavy focus is on the entry of big tech and new data-driven business models like buy now, pay later, on problems like algorithmic discrimination. Why is it that you're focusing there, and what are you hoping to accomplish?
Well, I really think we all have to really make sure we understand the implications of new technologies. And I'm a big believer that we have to embrace new technology. We have to be tech forward, but also we can't delude ourselves when technology may be used to sidestep the law or to give more power to a fewer set of firms that allow them to dictate more about our lives. We should want a transparent market, a competitive market. And here's some of the things we're doing. A lot more companies are engaged in algorithmic targeting, underwriting, and other lending. And we're trying to make crystal clear to them that just because your algorithm is fancy doesn't give you the ability to be exempt from laws that require you to explain to someone why they were denied for credit. And there's laws on the books that we have to make sure are used even in the modern era, because that's what the law is today. We are seeing how large tech companies and other tech firms are increasingly creeping into the payment system. A few years ago, Facebook concocted this Libra proposal where they were going to have their own currency. And while that didn't take place, we do know that big tech companies, Google Pay, Apple Pay, others, are looking to get more and more involved in knowing what we're spending on, where we're spending it at, and really part of their broader surveillance-based business model. So I really feel, Lisa, that we have to make sure that all of this technological progress, especially when it comes to the entry of these big tech titans, is actually leading to progress for everybody and not just concentrating more power with a handful of people.
Also super helpful, and I think we will come back to some more tech questions later. But as we're doing a little bit of broad scope, another place that I've noticed the Bureau putting out a fair amount of research and taking some actions over the last couple months is on medical debt collection. And it'd be great to talk a little bit about what you see as some of the issues there and what the Bureau can do in that space.
Yeah, so I hope that everyone who works on consumer issues, economic justice, healthcare issues, we've really got to do something about the explosion of medical debt uh, in our country. Medical debt is now one of the top items in consumer credit reports. I believe over 40 million people have it listed. And we've put together the analysis to showing that it's often not predictive of how someone will perform on their other loan obligations. And for many people, this is a constant doom loop between the insurance company, their medical provider. And I'm really worried that the consumer credit report is being used as a weapon to coerce people into paying medical bills they may not even owe or that they already paid. And so this is falling disproportionately on those who least have the means to fight back or to pay. Not everyone can simply pay that bill to make it go away. And it really can block people from other opportunities, including even passing an employment verification check or a tenant screening check. So we've been working to see what can we do to make sure that that it's accurate, and we're assessing whether it's appropriate at all for medically necessary medical debts to even be included on credit reports altogether.
Thanks. What appears on people's credit reports has so much impact on, so people have so little control over and so much impact on multiple features of their economic lives.
And the three big credit reporting conglomerates have announced that they will be eliminating the bulk of those debts from credit reports. We have assessed their plans that they've recently announced and still have concerns that the credit report can still be used as a weapon. And I think that's what we're looking to continue our work on.
It was really helpful to see your analysis there of like what was accomplished and the spaces still left, especially for lower income and lower wealth households by that move. So turning to something else that I know is a priority. Actually, before I do that, anything else I was going to ask about discrimination and what the Bureau is doing to fight discrimination in financial services, which I know is a priority. Before that, any other very big picture priorities you want to point to?
Well, I think we think about the discrimination piece of this as affecting so much of our work, whether it's how technology is being used, how there is a shift in the mortgage market away from banks to non-banks, but also how do we think about the Community Reinvestment Act to make sure that the banks that have obligations to serve people fairly, um, it's broader than any one anti-discrimination law. It's really about making sure that the financial system is fairly serving everyone.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I don't know if there's more you want to dive into around some of the different spaces where paying
Yeah,
attention to discrimination or unfair practices are important, whether
yeah,
that's tenant screening, student debt.
yeah. So I think one of the things I want to make sure everyone took note of, the CFPB brought its first law enforcement action with the DOJ against a non-bank mortgage lender. So while the banks are subject to ordinary oversight, a lot of these non-banks have not been. And so Trident Mortgage Company, we caught them engaging in a redlining scam. And it is owned by the Berkshire Hathaway conglomerate, discriminating against people in the Philadelphia area. We have brought other law enforcement actions addressing fair lending and mortgage redlining. But more broadly, we realize that the future is going to be about digital redlining, and how will discrimination be hidden in the code of some of these algorithms. And we want to make sure that that really doesn't happen. And so we've started to work more with other agencies about the use of artificial intelligence and other advanced computational models, because people really think, I've heard this over the past decade, that these algorithms can take bias out of the equation. The problem with that is data is also a reflection of the world we live in, which is not unbiased. And therefore, we have to make sure we're using those tools aggressively. When it comes to other things, the student, as you mentioned, we've been working together, Lisa, on student debt for a long time, and the problems are still out there. There is disproportionate impacts on women and on people of color, and we are always seeing what our actions can do to make sure we are not widening gaps. And often, abuses in the financial system do lead to widening gaps, and that's a real way in which we look at what we do. Housing outside of mortgages is also critically important. We are looking at ways to use our Fair Credit Reporting Act statute to combat some of these problems, like in tenant screening. With more and more corporate landlords and private equity owners of housing, we're seeing an increased use of tenant screening companies. We have made it clear to the market that when they use shoddy procedures like what's called name only match, which disproportionately has harmed African Americans, Asian Americans, and others with common surnames, we're making clear that that is illegal. So, all of what we're doing when it comes to discrimination is not just about one civil rights law, it's about all the laws we have at our disposal to tackle it.
And I think the way that you are thinking about the way that financial practices as they currently work so often amplify existing inequalities of wealth and access is such an important perspective that you are bringing to this work, and also thinking both about examples of exclusion from sustainable and fair products, and also of examples of predatory inclusion, which is some of what algorithms can drive.
Oh, yeah, reverse redlining, all of the ways in which that occurs. And I think Lisa recall that after the last financial crisis, that where abusive mortgage products were targeted in certain neighborhoods, we actually saw wealth gaps uh, dramatically widen and a lot of the gains go away. And I just think that's why. And I want to urge everyone who works on consumer issues, civil rights issues, housing issues, we've got to put our heads together to make sure that never happens again and that there really is fair access to financial services.
Absolutely. So in your comments so far, you've given some examples of enforcement actions as part of your overall strategy. And I think one thing we have seen you doing is really focusing on repeat offenders in the corporate world. Too often, I think big firms have gotten away with paying fines sort of as a cost of doing business that they can just brush off and carry on. What are some of the ways you're trying to change that and to approach enforcement differently? And why is that important?
Yeah, this is something that actually really bothers me. My observation of federal law enforcement is that agencies are willing to really slam a small business or a small player, naming the individual, shutting them down, and then sometimes with the same types of facts. It is totally different for a large player, and that just is wrong. We should be enforcing the law equally and not giving preferential treatment to those who have more power. And we certainly should not be giving preferential treatment to those with a history of breaking the law. So we are moving away from focusing just on these fines. Penalties will still be important, and absolutely restitution to the Americans that firms cheat is always going to be at the top of the list for me. But what are we going to do to actually change their behavior? We are going to be looking at halting certain types of business practices, maybe a further scrutiny in naming individual executives. The CFPB, in its repeat offender lawsuit against TransUnion, named a longtime top executive in the litigation. And I think that's going to be important to continue. I also think we are looking at all the tools that regulators have. The Federal Deposit Insurance Act authorizes the suspension or even termination of deposit insurance for banks engaging in unsafe and unsound practices repeatedly. So I think we have to really be clear that people cannot look at laws and orders as suggestions. When all of us are don't follow the law, we don't have the ability to just sort of write it off. It cannot be seen as a line item on an income statement. It has to be seen with the dignity of rule of law when it comes to how we regulate firms in this country. So there's a lot more we're doing. We're focusing on large market actors. We've had a number of repeat offenses. We've sued Ace Cash Express. We've sued MoneyGram. We've sued First Cash, the nation's largest pawn lender. And I think it's important that while there is a huge amount of fraud, the CFPB always has to focus on the biggest ones perpetrating the most harm.
Very helpful. Thank you. So turning back to technology, or at least a partially technology-focused question, the agency is working on rulemaking right now on personal financial data rights, and that can sound like a very technical or very insider, or very like matter between financial institutions. Why should the public care about this? Why does this matter in the real world?
Yeah. So, Lisa, I just think technology, it doesn't work well when it further entrenches a small clique of companies. Really, technology is supposed to give each individual more bargaining leverage, more options, more choices. So I really see our personal financial data rights rulemaking as a step toward giving people the ability to fire their financial company, fire their bank that is not serving them well or that is not giving them the best deal. That's how competition should work. It shouldn't work by people feeling trapped in a particular account because it's so complicated and annoying to be able to switch it. We should be able to switch our business more quickly, more seamlessly, and the benefits will go to individuals. It will force these firms to up their game on customer service and offer people a better deal. So that's really how I see making the market work better and leveraging technology that gives people more control, over their financial destiny.
So a technology that has been in the news in the last couple of weeks for some pretty dramatic crashing is cryptocurrency. I'd be interested in hearing how you think of the CFPB's role here, and what lessons regulators should be learning from the meltdown that's happening right now.
Well, big picture, and then I'll talk to the CFPB piece. In many ways, regulators were smart not to allow a lot of speculative, risky crypto assets into the banking system. Because if these big explosions happen, guess who would be on the hook to pay up? Taxpayers. So, in some ways, we have to be cautious and skeptical about putting that in the public safety net and really make sure that insured deposits, things that are protected by the public, really are safe and secure. Now, a couple things about FTX, crypto. We recently released an analysis showing how crypto is increasingly a vector for fraud, romance scams, so-called pig butchering. The ways in which people are getting cheated often are using crypto as a vector. We often saw a few years ago how prepaid cards, gift cards were a big vehicle, and crypto is now becoming a vehicle of choice. I really want to make sure that we are thinking about digital currencies in the context of real time payments. So the US is slowly shifting to real time payments. And I think the benefits of that could be big for small businesses to get paid more quickly. Imagine a world where employees and workers got paid every day. That would be a pretty different world, and one where it would lead to much less debt. But how that real time payment system is created, um, will it just lead to an explosion of fraud? And what might be the role of things like stable coins, the so-called cryptocurrencies that are pegged to the dollar? I really hope that the CFPB and the Fed and others, we are able to shape a payment system that really delivers benefits for businesses and families, and not just really, again, shift more control to a small group of players.
Yeah, I certainly. We have been worried that the evidence that protecting the core banking system from the dangers of crypto, and B, the need to really vigorously protect consumers and use existing authorities, that the industry has such a powerful voice that they are going to use even this moment of crisis to argue for for regulation that's actually permission to do more harm, rather than consumer protection.
Yeah, no, and look, about it's just such a good case study about conflicts of interest, about gambling with customer funds. We finalized an enforcement action today against a company called Loan Doctor.
Mhm.
And this outfit was marketing deposit accounts, actually a high rate CD, people trying to save, and get a higher interest rate. In reality, they were putting those funds in an affiliated hedge fund and even depositing it in crypto networks like Celsius Network, which is now bankrupt. So we're seeing how, all of this is fitting together. And ultimately, we can't really play a game of whack a mole. We really need to make sure that the whole system is safe.
Speaking of recent actions, not quite as recent as that today, two things that caught my attention over the last month or two that I'd love to hear anything you want to add around. One was that the agency recently filed an amicus brief along with the FTC in a case to enforce the Military Lending Act, which protects active duty service members. So be interested in anything you want to add about that. And then also that you recently opened a process to collect more data on auto lending, and interested in why you've turned attention there.
So we're very lucky at the CFPB to have a really strong bench of folks who really know about service member financial services. For those who are not as aware, uh, there was a very large influx of financial challenges that active duty members of the military faced, especially in the transition after service in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the Military Lending Act is a place that it's one of our nation's laws that sets an interest rate cap. It prohibits forced arbitration. Um, and it's a really critical consumer protection for military families. And one of the things we're doing is we're not just enforcing it. In fact, our case against the nation's largest pawn lender, First Cash, is a Military Lending Act case, and we've taken others as well. But we also want to make sure that individual service members have the ability to enforce their own rights. So it's not just enforcement that we're doing, we're also working with the DoD and working with the courts to be able to ensure that American service members can enforce those rights in court. We want to make clear, just like Congress did, that when a lender extends a loan to a service member and fails to comply with the Military Lending Act, the loan is rendered void. And that's what Congress decided, and that's what we're seeking to protect. You also mentioned auto. Auto loans are growing at a really fast clip. The cost of vehicles, because of the global chip shortage, has made cars very expensive for a lot of families. We are seeing some of the biggest increases in auto lending that we've ever seen. And so we've taken some early steps to make sure that the industry knows when you repossess a car, you better have the right information to know that you actually can do it. We want to make sure that repos are fair, that people can find alternatives to refinance their auto loan. And honestly, Lisa, I really see that all the work that was done on mortgage and on student debt, we've really got to tackle auto loans and medical debt and really analyze and understand it, because an auto loan is one of the most important financial products that people will ever get. And so we want to make sure that it's a necessity to get to work, to get to live their life. We want to make sure that people can have find a loan in a competitive market.
Yeah, people are, because it's such a necessity, people are so much at the mercy of bad actors if there's not clear rules here. So shifting back to the very big picture, the Fifth Circuit recently issued a decision in a case brought by payday lenders that the CFPB's funding structure is unconstitutional. So your rules and other actions should all be voided. And the Solicitor General has now asked the Supreme Court to hear this case. What can you say about what's going on here? What impact it has? What happens next?
So I sadly can't say much because there's a petition by the Solicitor General, as you mentioned, to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will decide whether to hear it. All I can say is that the CFPB and the Fed's funding structure is not novel or unusual. Every single bank regulator, the FDIC, the OCC, the National Credit Union Administration, has a funding structure that is outside of the annual political circus of the appropriations process. Of course, Congress can pass laws to change it, but there really isn't anything unusual. So we'll see how that plays out. But it's clear that uh, the CFPB is being targeted, and the implications of an adverse court decision will have a huge impact on, you know, people, communities, the financial system. And so we really need a strong CFPB if we want to be in a position to prevent future crises.
Thanks. So a last question for me before we start taking some of the questions that came in from the audience, and I will be turning to the left to look at the screen where they came in. But are there things that an easy one for you? Are there things that we haven't talked about yet, or that we have but you want to underline for people who are not familiar with the Bureau? What would you want them to know? The most important things for them to know about the Bureau's work?
Well, I think one of the things that people should really try to think through is that we're not some technical regulator. We're here to be financial first responders to the people who most need help. And we do that in so many ways. I really hope that everyone can check out our consumer complaint database. People can file a complaint and we ask that the bank respond in a certain number of days. And often people are getting refunds and problems fixed rather than battling call center after call center after call center. So I really see what we do as helping people fix problems and making markets work. I know that people um, are seeing how much there are so many financial companies that operate outside of the traditional banking system, and it's an increasingly growing part of the pie. And there has to be someone that is ensuring some base level accountability for companies that break the law. And that's really what we do. I think, Lisa, you might be on mute.
I was on mute. Apologies. I'm back off mute. All right. Thank you. So, as turning to figuring out what's come in, let me start with a question just about returning to student debt and student loan servicing and how you're thinking about your approach there now.
So just to give everyone on the same page. So student loan debt, $1.6 trillion. Even if the president's loan cancellation, once that goes through the system, it's resolved. Regardless of what happens there will still be millions of people with student loans who will be repaying again. And we have seen over and over how when there are system breakdowns, when there is deceptive information by student loan servicers, these companies that collect payments, there can be real harm. We recently did an enforcement action against a servicer, Ed Financial Services, for misrepresentations related to the public service loan forgiveness program. So we are readying to oversee these servicers, particularly if and when payments restart in July. And we have to make sure that we don't have the same breakdowns that we had in the past. Ultimately, though, Lisa, there will need to be a longer term um, set of work we all have to do about what is the future of the student loan industry and student loan market, and what have we learned from all of the scandals, the student loan kickback scandal, breakdowns at Navient and their service member overcharging scheme, all the issues with how some of the banks abuse the federal loan system. It's going to be time to think about what's next.
Absolutely. Okay. So we have a question about how you think about the kind of relationship between the mission and the role of the FTC in your previous role there and your current role and mission of the Bureau.
Yeah, it's a great question. The FTC really is also one of our key bulwarks to protect against corporate abuses. And while I was there, uh, I had I voted against a sweetheart settlement with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. And I saw how agencies really roll over for powerful repeat offenders. And it seems especially true in the technology sector. Facebook, Google, others caught repeatedly breaking the law, and almost it feels like headline driven settlements, not meaningful accountability. And as those tech giants increasingly enter financial services, I just don't want to see that culture persist. I want to see a financial system that is open, fair, lots of players, that you don't feel stuck with dealing with someone. And there's a lot of work to do there. I'll also share that I think the FTC really has helped to rethink um, what is going on in the digital world, dark patterns, other ways that consumers and Americans are cheated, digital discrimination, not just in financial services, but across the board. So I really hope that everyone in government can be preparing and harnessing technology for the good and not let it be a vehicle for abuse.
Not a bad transition to a question or two that I'm turning into the more general version of which is concern about requirements that people's banking be digital only, that then leaves people feeling like they are exposed to hacking without recourse, or perhaps to other lack of control of their own information without recourse. And how are you thinking about what can be done there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you see happening is while technological progress can really change markets, there also can be people left behind, and many of them have very good reason for not being able to adopt some of those digital only. So there's a few ways, Lisa, we've been thinking about that. One is modernization of the Community Reinvestment Act, which is really a very dated framework about how banks should fairly serve their communities, especially in light of more digital only banks. But two, how do we preserve relationship banking in the context of the rise of algorithms and big data? And so, how do we make sure that people do have local options where they can even obtain in-person help and services? Um, so I do want to make sure that we are not technology should really help include people and not lead to further exclusion.
Thanks. A more kind of process question about how we can foster coordination and cooperation, and I guess also what the current state of play is on coordination and cooperation between state agencies and the Bureau, and how the public can work to see those entities work together. Yeah.
So a couple of things. One of the things we learned in the last financial crisis is that you had states sounding the alarm and even passing laws to protect against predatory mortgage lending. And here's was the reaction from Washington, particularly an agency called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. That agency basically hit delete on those laws through something called preemption. And abuse of preemption has really been curtailed by federal law and certainly at the CFPB. Instead, we're taking the opposite approach. We have issued legal interpretations and other guidance to make clear that state attorneys general, state regulators can bring enforcement actions under the law that created the CFPB. Congress was clear about it, and we are regularly working with those states to prosecute those actions, and we want to see more. I would urge everyone who is working with states to be able to bring to them, not just to us, but bring to them the cases that they'd like to see prosecuted, including where federal consumer financial protection law is implicated, because they also have the keys to do that. And we're going to be working further with them to make sure that the CFPB Victims Relief Fund, where we deposit penalties against bad actors, can also be used to redress victims on investigations that states are pursuing. So I want to think more with you, Lisa, about what are the ways all of us can be coordinating on that. But here's why it's so important is that sometimes agencies in Washington, D.C. act like a dead fish, and there needs to be a backup to when someone's not living up to their responsibilities. So the way we have durable and lasting enforcement, consumer protection is when it's all hands on deck and where no agency has a pure monopoly on enforcement.
Thanks for that. And that piece of Dodd-Frank that gives states that authority, I think, as you point out, is really, really important. Here's a question about a specific set of problems, noting that millions of workers, including predominantly low wage or low middle wage workers and disproportionately people of color, have found themselves trapped by employer driven debt. What role do you see the Bureau as having in addressing that market, and where are there places that other federal and state regulators need to take the lead or should be doing?
So this is something that I hope all of you are seeing what's happening. You know, it's almost like student debt is now morphing. When you start a job, many workers are being asked, and it doesn't seem voluntary at all, to pay and sign up for a loan to finance their training or other required costs of doing their job. And the challenge with it is it's another way that potentially impedes someone from finding a different job that pays better because they'll be stuck with a big balloon loan payment. So we have launched an inquiry and collected a lot of information from the public about this employer driven debt. We're working with the National Labor Relations Board, the Department of Labor, and others about some of these practices, and of course with states as well. So stay tuned on more coming down that way, because we really think we need to get ahead of this before it explodes into almost every workplace in America, and to make very clear that those individuals are not just exempted from basic rules of the road because it's in the employment context.
Thanks. A kind of follow up on that. Some of the work that you all have done on those employer-driven debts has come out of the initiative that you've put together to focus in a couple different areas, including kind of consumer problems affecting people as workers in their working lives. And one other such initiative is an initiative focused on rural communities. So I don't know if there's any of the areas of focus of that.
Yeah, well, I really think that at some point we need to rethink the traditional conception of the consumer. You know, we're not consumers or workers or brothers and sisters. I mean, we have multiple identities as human beings. And it's not just when someone is shopping for a loan, in all of where they are situated, whether they're a farmer, whether they are an immigrant, whether they are a member of the military, everyone deserves the protections of the laws when it comes to a fair financial system. And frankly, so do the law abiding businesses who have to compete with fraudsters or others who break the law. So I think let's really start looking at this term consumer protection and rethinking what it means. It's also protecting workers, it's also protecting businesses, it's also making sure that we have a real fair economy that is working. So I really believe that what the CFPB does is not in just a narrow bucket, it is fundamental for how people can advance their financial well being, protect their financial future, and frankly, just participate in the American dream.
Thanks. So, maybe building on that, there's a couple questions from folks thinking about how, going back to, you talked a little bit about the way that credit reporting of medical debt can be used as a kind of a weapon to enable entities to collect on inappropriate debts. We have a couple questions of, very specific examples of how you're thinking about and how the CFPB can address, and where it has tools to address some of the problems of just unfair and unwarranted billing and manipulative billing practices.
Are you referring to in medical
In
context?
the medical
Yeah.
context, like
So
massive overcharges and
yeah, so it's interesting. The place where we have the most focus is related to our laws protecting against debt collection abuses and credit reporting abuses. So the primary focus has been, if they are furnishing to credit reports, is it accurate? Is it real? And then thinking more broadly about what's the right role of the credit report if there's anyone at all. So, as it relates to broader manipulative billing and other practices, I think we see in the healthcare industry writ large that as there are more sophisticated investors scooping up more rehab centers, more nursing homes, other types of facilities, you're starting to see more aggressive practices. And that's really a place we often have discussions with the Department of Health and Human Services, with state AGs. But I think over time, we're going to have insurance regulators better use their tools. We're going to have to really look harder at some of these hospital mergers that have been allowed to go through, which ultimately patients pay the price for. So there's a lot of things related to healthcare, financial services, antitrust, insurance, and we've got to figure out how to use all those tools to tackle people's financial problems here.
So, returning also to the conversation about enforcement, we have a question following up on the relationship between the civil violations that you are looking at and what are or might be criminal violations, and how that connects to the kinds of work you're trying to do to have to actually enforce the law and have enforcement of the law
Yeah.
not just be a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, so the CFPB is not a criminal enforcement agency. That's the Justice Department. But there's no question that many of the worst abuses may implicate criminal law. And, you know, many of if you think about some of the scandals related to fake accounts, I mean, in some ways, that's stealing someone's identity. There's many ways in which fraudsters are going after older Americans or veterans that may be better prosecuted as criminal law violations. One of the things that we do is, when we identify that type of fraud, we really alert US attorneys, the Justice Department, others. And sometimes we will continue to pursue that civil action because we want to be able to get restitution and penalties. But I think what I'm understanding the question to be is that one of the real ways you deter this is corporate criminal law enforcement. And we have to really make sure that all of the civil law enforcement agencies are able to successfully get the Justice Department and states all working together to root out this kind of behavior. There has been situations where financial firms have pled guilty to criminal activity, LIBOR manipulation. There's been a few other forex manipulation. There's been some recent incidents, but I think the questioner may be asking, should we be doing more? And the answer is probably yes.
Great. So one last narrow question, and then I'll, or not narrow, but yeah, specific question, and then if you have any closing things you want to say after that. There are a couple questions about the tools that the Bureau has to protect tenants. You talked about this a little in connection with credit reporting, but
Yeah, so across the country, people are really battling very high housing costs. And I think if you were to rewind 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people would talk about this as a kind of Manhattan, San Francisco problem. This is everywhere now. The percentage of people's income going to rent has become much, much higher. And it's not totally clear to me when that will really abate. And so this does create some push to aggressively evict if there's ways to make money out of it. Our core tool when it comes to tenant protections is the Fair Credit Reporting Act as it relates to tenant screening, and the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act when it comes to third party evictions and collections. But I see our role as a mortgage regulator um, to work with the other housing agencies so tenants really know how to assert their rights and how to protect themselves from these types of abuses. So I continue to think that while foreclosures and evictions were pretty gory and pernicious in the last crisis, a lot of times those evictions don't get as much attention because they tend not to have a ripple effect on the financial system, but they have an enormous amount of family and neighborhood pain, and the impact on the children in those households and on the individuals is enormous. And when when illegal practices are employed, it, it, it's just incredibly damaging. So while we are not necessarily the ones with all the law enforcement powers to stop those abuses, we have some tools when it comes to protecting renters under those laws, and we're looking to use them. I hope people will take a look at our recent analysis and market reports on the tenant screening industry, which is really overdue for accountability and change.
thanks. So I think we are just about out of time. Any closing thoughts?
Well, I just want to thank everyone who was part of not just helping to enact financial reforms, but also working to steward them into the future. We really don't know what the future of the economy looks like, and the CFPB is not in the business of making macroeconomic projections. But there is clear uncertainties in the globe. And if there is any type of deterioration in the US economy, we're going to need a strong and decisive regulatory system, and particularly the CFPB, to stop harm from spreading and to be part of making sure that the system is fair, that discriminatory practices are tackled, and to make sure that the future of the financial system, particularly with these tech companies, is one that really serves us all. So I just want to encourage everyone who works with the Americans for Financial Reform to keep us in mind so that we can all respond together if economic trouble lies ahead.
I want to thank you very much for this conversation today, and much more for the work that you and your colleagues at the Bureau are doing. We look forward to continuing the conversation in many forms as the work goes forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much.